My name is Jehu, son of Nimshi. I was never meant to be king. I was a warrior, a soldier. My place was on the battlefield, not a throne. My hands knew the weight of a sword, the grip of a spear knot, the burden of ruling a nation. But Israel had fallen into darkness. King Joram, son of Ahab, ruled weakly, his will rotted by corruption. His mother, Jezebel, still pulled the strings of power, leading the people to worship Baal. False prophets filled the land. Blood of the innocent stained the streets, and Yahweh had had enough. It started on an ordinary day. My officers and I were in camp, resting after a battle. The air smelled of sweat and sand. Our armor was streaked with dust, and laughter filled the tent. Then, the prophet arrived. A young man, wild-eyed and breathless, rushed in. His robes were loose, his hair tangled from the wind. He barely paused to greet us. "Commander Jehu, I have a message for you." I frowned. "For me?" The officers chuckled, elbowing me. "Go on, Jehu," one said. "Maybe he's got good news." I stood, following the young man into a private tent. The moment the flap closed, he grabbed a flask of oil from his belt and poured it over my head. The oil ran down my face, into my beard, soaking my tunic. I gasped, stepping back, but his words froze me in place. "This is what the Lord says. I anoint you king of Israel. You will strike down the house of Ahab, avenge the blood of God's prophets, and cleanse the land of corruption." Before I could even speak, the prophet turned and fled from the tent. I wiped the oil from my eyes. My heart pounded. Me? King? I stepped outside, blinking in the sunlight. My officers gathered around me, looking amused. "Well?" one asked. "What did that madman say?" I took a deep breath. He said, "The Lord has made me king." For a moment, silence. Thina, roar of approval. They laid their cloaks before me. They blew their trumpets. They shouted, "Jehu is king." And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. There was no time to waste. Joram, the king of Israel, was in Jezreel, recovering from battle wounds. His ally, King Ahaziah of Judah, was with him, and Jezebel still ruled from the palace. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. I turned to my officers. "Arm the men. We ride at once." I leaped into my chariot, gripping the reins. The horses snorted, their muscles tense beneath them. Then I drove. The wheels groaned, the hooves thundered, and the desert wind howled past my face. My men struggled to keep up as I raced toward Jezreel, my heart pounding with a new kind of fire. A fire of judgment. Far ahead, a watchman stood atop Jezreel's walls. He saw the dust rising in the distance, the trembling earth beneath the pounding hooves, the glint of chariots racing toward the city. He shouted down, "A chariot approaches. It rides like a madman." King Joram, still recovering from his wounds, sat up. He frowned. "It must be Jehu," he muttered. "He sent a messenger to intercept me." The rider galloped toward me, raising a hand. "Commander Jehu, do you come in peace?" I did not. Slow. "What do you know of peace?" I called. "Fall in behind me or die." The messenger hesitated. Then he turned his horse and joined my ranks. The watchman reported this. Joram frowned again and sent another rider. The second messenger met the same fate. The watchman's voice was urgent now. "The messengers are not returning!" Joram leaped onto his chariot, his wounds forgotten. He rode out of Jezreel, King Ahaziah at his side. The two kings faced me in the open plain. Joram's eyes narrowed. "Jehu, do you come in peace?" I pulled the reins tight, bringing my chariot to a screeching halt. The dust settled between us. My voice was like thunder. "How can there be peace while Jezebel still fills Israel with sorcery and murder?" Joram's face drained of color. His eyes widened with fear. He wheeled his chariot around, shouting, "Treachery! Ahaziah! Treachery!" But he was too slow. Twang! The arrow whistled through the air and pierced Joram's heart. He gasped a short, sharp sound before slumping forward. His chariot slowed. Then his body tumbled to the ground. Ahaziah turned his chariot, fleeing toward Beth-Hagan. After him, I barked. My men pursued. A second arrow flew. Ahaziah fell, bleeding into the dust. Two kings, two buddies. The first pieces of Ahab's house had fallen, but the real prize was still ahead. Jezebel, Jezreel's palace, loomed ahead. I could still smell Joram's blood in the air, but there was no time to reflect. There was still one more serpent to crush. Jezebel, the queen mother, the puppet master of Israel, the one who had brought Baal worship into the land, slaughtered the Lord's prophets, and silenced any who opposed her rule. She had thought herself untouchable, but the judgment of Yahweh had come to her. I stormed into the city, my chariot still streaked with dust, my men close behind. We rode straight to the palace, where Jezebel waited, and there she stood in the window. I pulled my chariot to a stop, looking up at her. Even now, she did not cower. She had painted her eyes with kohl, dark and sharp like a blade. She wore her royal robes, her finest jewelry glinting in the last light of the sun. She looked every bit the queen, but I could see it. Behind the mask of pride, behind the painted face fear, she leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. "So, Jehu, have you come in peace? Or will you meet the same fate as Zimri, the traitor who murdered his master?" I narrowed my eyes. Peace? This woman spoke of peace after all the blood she had spilled. The audacity of it made my jaw clench. I did not bother answering her. Instead, I lifted my gaze above her to the palace guards standing behind her. I shouted, "Who's on my side? Who?" A pause. The guards glanced at each other. They had served Jezebel for years. But now they saw the writing on the wall. They saw the fate of Joram, the death of Ahaziah. They saw the end of Ahab's dynasty. And so they stepped forward. Jezebel's eyes widened. She turned, but it was too late. The guards grabbed her arms. She screamed as they dragged her toward the ledge. I gave a single nod, and then they threw her down. Time seemed to slow. Jezebel plummeted, her robes billowing, her arms flailing, her gold bracelets flashing in the dying sunlight. Then crash, her body smashed into the pavement below, her bones shattering like pottery. Blood splattered against the stones. Some of it struck the very hooves of my horses. One of the men beside me grimaced, but I did not look away. Jezebel, the once great queen, the destroyer of Israel, lay broken in the dust. I exhaled. It was done. I turned to my men. "Bury her," I said finally. She was, after all, a king's daughter. We left the scene, entering the palace to take control. Sometime later, the men returned, their faces pale. "My lord," one said, "there is nothing left to bury." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The dogs. They've devoured her. All that remains is her skull, her hands, and her feet." For a moment, silence. Then, like a whisper, the words of the prophet echoed in my mind. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. Her body will be like dung on the field, so that no one may say, "This was Jezebel." The prophecy had come true. Even in death, she would have no grave. Her name would be erased from history. And with that, the reign of Ahab's house had ended. Jezebel was dead. Joram and Ahaziah were dead. But Ahab's legacy was not yet finished. He had 70 sons still living in Samaria, the capital city. If I left them alive, one of them would rise up, take the throne, and continue the cycle of corruption. I would not allow that. So I sent them a message. I wrote to the city officials, elders, and guardians of Ahab's sons. You have your master's 70 sons. You have chariots, weapons, and strongholds. If you are loyal to Ahab's house, choose one of his sons, crown him king, and prepare for battle. I sent the message, knowing what would happen next. Terror swept through Samaria. They knew they could not stand against me. So instead, they sent a reply. "We are your servants, Jehu. We will do whatever you command. We will not make any of Ahab's sons king." I wrote back only one sentence. "Then, bring me the heads of Ahab's sons." By morning, 70 heads were stacked at the gates of Jezreel. Ahab's bloodline was no more. One final task remained. Israel had been poisoned by Baal worship. Jezebel and Ahab had led the people into idolatry, building temples, appointing hundreds of false prophets, and sacrificing to a god that was not Yahweh. That ended now. I sent out a declaration across Israel. Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu will serve him much. Gather all Baal's prophets, all his priests, all his worshippers. Let none be missing, for I am preparing a great sacrifice to Baal. The fools believed me. They flocked to the great temple of Baal, filling it wall to wall. They cheered, they celebrated. They thought I was their new champion. But when they were all inside, I stood at the entrance, turned to my guards, and gave the order. Kill them all. My soldiers stormed the temple, swords flashing. No one escaped. The temple itself was torn down, its altar smashed, its idols reduced to rubble. Baal was erased from Israel. The kingdom was mine, but I was not a gentle ruler. I was a storm, a sword in the hand of Yahweh. I did not bring peace with kind words. I brought it with fire, steel, and speed. Some call me a butcher, some called me a madman, but none could deny the will of God had been done. And when my chariot thundered across the land, everyone knew one thing: nothing could stand in my way.